welcome at the live stream and the physical event, Bridging the Narratives. Some rules, house rules that I want to remind you of. We request that everyone who attends this meeting, physically or digitally, will respect the portrait rights, the privacy rights of all persons portrayed, as well as the copyrights resting in the content shown. There is a photographer from the organization and he will not make pictures of the audience. This event will be live streamed and will be available afterwards on the NIOD YouTube channel. And it's not permitted to make video and or sound recording and to reproduce or publish them without prior written permission from NIOD KNW. And then to solve the first confusion, I heard people are thinking that Onze Revolutie is the Dutch translation of Revolutionary Worlds. That's not the same. Onze Revolutie, it's a bundling, a volume of important Indonesian written articles translated into Dutch so that Dutch audience can read them. And the Revolutionary Worlds is the research results of the regional research of the project of the Otgooi. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, excuse me. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank you all for taking the time and effort to come to Leiden to join today's event. The presentation of the books Revolutionary Worlds and Onze Revolutie could not take place without strong collaborations between the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies, KITLV, the Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, NIOD, the Netherlands Institute of Military History, NIMH, and Gadjah Mada University in Indonesia. The books are the result of a collaboration between the Indonesian research project Proclamation of Independence, Revolution and War in Indonesia and the Dutch research group of the Regional Studies Projects. Both projects fall under the umbrella of the research program Independence, Decolonization, Violence and War in Indonesia, 1945-1949. Revolutionary Worlds and Onze Revolutie emphasize the need to look at history making and remaking from the perspective of actors and institutions, across scales from national to transnational to local. It links important events with local everyday practices and how they are in fact intertwined with one another. Revolutionary Worlds takes a people-centered approach and puts human dimension central in understanding how history unfolds. It focuses on the role of society in shaping histories, sometimes consciously, but often also unconsciously. It shows how society works holistically, albeit sometimes through its own fragmented ways. It reveals how historical events and outcomes cannot be analyzed in isolation from the multiple forces and perspectives within the society. It emphasizes that history is not always shaped by dominant groups within the society, but can manifest itself through the mingling of multiple perspectives and interests of actors and institutions. These actors and institutions range from politicians, military leaders, writers, women, youth, to Chinese and Indian ethnic minorities in various contexts and geographies. Revolutionary Worlds introduces and highlights the importance of looking at history in the context of everyday life. It urges us to move away from understanding history from the context of grand narratives alone, unpacking multiple grassroots realities and how these are shaped by day-to-day power struggles. This leads towards a better understanding of their contributions in making and remaking histories, including the role of violence. This approach enables us to unpack the complex entanglements in Indonesia's struggles for independence. It also sheds light on how these struggles create the nation-state identities and how these identities predetermine the characteristic of the Indonesian state at present. Beyond heroisms and moving away from depiction of self and others, both books embrace multiple realities shaped by multiple logics and perspectives as a starting point for enriching and bridging the gaps in our understandings of histories. Here, the authors of the books do not totally separate imagination and aspirations from hard facts, but presented as an integral part of historical analysis. Such an approach introduces an alternative way to look at and understand power structure and power relations. This brings to light how power constellations and coalition building could emerge as a result of collective action, and how such action was driven by multiple, often conflicting goals and interests. Here, collective action is treated as a manifestation of both unified and fragmented forces and perceptions of what the nation states should entail, thus creating the different parallel and intersecting pathways towards these diverse aspirations. Revolutionary Wilt and Onze Revolutie will in different ways be one of the foundations for linking and bridging Dutch and Indonesian historiographies while striving for equal partnership, as evident from the two-way direction in the translation works. Together, we learned that while we could always opt for the path of agreeing to disagree, the more fascinating journey is to seek for alternative ways for continuous engagement through many forms of collaboration and dialogue. The contributors to Revolutionary Wilt and Onze Revolutie have created spaces for such collaboration and dialogue. The path is there, and it is now open for us to decide how we want to fill in these spaces. Arguments and points of view matter, but without empathy and willingness to learn about different perspectives, our position would remain rigid. We would miss the opportunity to truly rethink our own positioning and understanding of history making and remaking. I trust we can continue this journey together, and that these two books are only the start of many more collaboration in the future. So still related to the idea of rethinking our own position, I would like to make a brief illustrations about my recent visit to Indonesia last year. So this is the building in the picture is from a railway station in Cirebon, West Java. The building was the work of a Dutch architect, Pieter Adriaan Jacobus Mooyen, and was built by the train company Stadsspoorwegen in 1912. Its architecture resembles a certain period in Indonesia's colonial history, with its architectural style referred to as New Indie style. The building itself represents a remembrance of the past, perhaps a bygone era. At the same time, the building is so much more than just a recollection of the past. Following the Indonesian independence, the Republican government took over the building while continuing its function as a train station. As of today, it continues to function as a train station that connects busy towns like Cirebon to capital Jakarta and other towns in Java like Semarang, Surabaya, Bandung, and Yogyakarta. As a child, I used to associate the train station with exciting holidays and family visits. It is a place where daily laborers earn their income by providing services like carrying the bags and suitcases of the train passengers. It is also a place which the students and workforce rely on for their travel from one town to another to establish and strengthen networks and connections. It is also a place where seasonal brokers would try to make quick money but by buying tickets early and selling it with a higher price later. Obviously, the functions of the station building are not fixed, but ever-changing as we seek and shape ways to integrate it into our everyday life. Somehow, and perhaps in a strange way, it presents how people powers prevail in history making, as ordinary people shape histories through their abilities to give a myriad of functions and identities of the station building, both in the past and the present. The station serves not only as an architectural witness of history continuously in the making, but also how people connect the past with the present in many different, sometimes unexpected ways. The same applies to the very building in which we are giving the book presentation today, the Museum of Volkenkunde. The museum has a colonial history of its own, but today we show that such relation is not fixed or cast in stone. On the contrary, today we show that we too can reshape these relations and identities. So finally, I would like to thank the editors and all chapter authors for these excellent and timely contributions. Without your determination, open-mindedness, and sheer motivation, we would not be here today for the book launch. Special thanks go to Irene Hogenboom, who has worked immensely, exhausting the limits of possible in finalizing the last steps of the book productions. I would also like to thank Taufik Hanafi, Henriette van Engelenhoven, and Clarijn Loven for translating the book, and our partners from Amsterdam University Press, Jan-Peter Wissing and May Meurs. And now I would like to invite Ratna Saptari and Wim Manuhutu. Ratna Saptari is an anthropologist. She has written extensively on gender and labor relations, workplace politics, collective and individual memories. She is the author of the book Nationhood and Labor Politics in the Decolonization Process. Wim Manuhutu is a historian and former director of the Museum Maluku. He has been actively involved in various interdisciplinary debates on the initiative of the Dutch cultural institutions in the field of cultural heritage, contemporary art, and ethnography. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for this opportunity of asking an anthropologist to discuss two historical books. I find it very important, and it brings also various issues that we often don't discuss in our knowledge about our own histories. So what I would like to focus on are mainly four issues. First of all, the writing of history, and then how the revolution was shaped by different structures of power, and also the different subjects or actors involved in the anti-colonial struggle. And lastly, maybe a little bit some comments about ideas for future research. First of all, writing history. Writing history, especially writing national history, is not only an intellectual or academic activity, but also an activity that has political significance. Many of us, whether in the Netherlands or in Indonesia, have all gone through or participated in official memorialization ceremonies of national independence, which in the Indonesian case has always been celebrated on the 17th of August. And much, although in the Netherlands it's seen differently. Much focus has been given to events or heroes that are considered to represent national identities. And until now, the debates regarding who should be classified as the perpetrators of violence, as heroes or victims in the struggles for independence or emancipation, and which events or happenings are considered important to document and register or not, have not ended. Various claims regarding origins, territorial sovereignty, legitimacy of power holders, national hero status, who are the enemies and who are the victims have long been the subject of historical debate, both for political actors and historians. What is being silenced or made invisible, for instance, is a significant factor in the shaping of memory culture, but also it shows how the politics and ideologies of the present shape also the memory culture regarding the past. And we can see this even until now. Why is historical writing about the past so important? This is because history is considered as the basis of historical awareness, whose function is to strengthen national or collective identity. And this is one of the reasons why disagreements over how the past should be presented and how facts are created become an endless battle, but still important to discuss. If we admit that the history of what happened and the history of what is said to have happened are two dimensions of historical writing, then we must also admit that the debate about the extent to which there is a sharp boundary between the two dimensions is an ongoing process. Recently, much has been written also by Dutch historians regarding colonial violence and the war landscape in Indonesia to counter earlier narratives of silence. The key contribution, in my view, of both these books, Revolutionary Worlds and Onze Revolutie, is that both of them attempt to examine the complexities of power relations between the colonizer and the colonized by examining carefully what constitutes the nationalist narrative of revolution, which groups were involved, and what it meant for their position within the local power dynamics. But both books attempt to examine both the subjectives and subjectivities involved in various regions during the creation of the Republic of Indonesia. The competition, alliances, and collaboration between different actors. Case studies in these two books cover the areas of Java, South Sulawesi, Aceh, West Sumatra, and East Sumatra. But before I briefly go further with the discussion on these two publications, I would like to state that it is very heartwarming to see the contribution and collaboration of both Dutch and Indonesian historians in producing these various chapters. This involves, as mentioned in the introduction of Revolutionary Worlds, also a recognition of the possibility of blind spots, obtained through different educational traditions with regard to their own national histories, and to be aware and reflect upon the possibility of any form of historical amnesia. It is worth mentioning that the chapters in Revolutionary Worlds were written by 11 Indonesian and 5 Dutch researchers, whereas the chapters in Onze Revolutie, Our Revolution, were all written by Indonesian researchers from different generations who wrote their contributions in different periods in history, most of them taken from the Indonesian journal Prisma, and were published between the 1970s and the present day. As stated in the introduction of Revolutionary Worlds, this volume underlines the importance of a non-monolithic approach, without erasing an understanding of the nationalist narratives and how this gained momentum. This is clearly explained in the introduction of Revolutionary Worlds, why the term worlds is used in the plural to underline the various experiential worlds of the diverse Dutch and Indonesian subjects in the case studies. An important statement in the introduction of this book highlights the argument that these worlds existed both locally and nationally, and consisted of a myriad of groups and individuals which were both organized and disorganized. Onze Revolutie, as I have already mentioned, is a collection of articles written by Indonesian researchers between the 1970s and the present period. And it examines also complexities surrounding the struggle towards independence, as the colonial control through its military actions was also combined with the inclusion of primordial structures within both the colonial and the post-colonial institutions. The translation of this collection has made this important body of work available to Dutch readers, and hopefully in the future also to English-speaking readers. As stated in the chapter in Onze Revolutie, the term revolution itself is a broad definition, involving the means, the process, and the result. And even within these different phases, through the case studies, we can see that in many cases, this is an ongoing process. One can also see that the process of decolonization, or as argued in one of the chapters, decolonialization, the fight for independence was undertaken through various means, through diplomacy, war, collective protests on the streets, or through the use of media, and often a combination of all these processes. Revolutionary Worlds examines the diverse trajectories where competition or warfare was not just between the Dutch colonial powers and the Indonesian nationalist movement, but also within these two groupings, where there were also internal differences and conflicts. The blurred boundaries between the colonizers and colonized, or between collaborator and combatant, nevertheless ultimately resulted in the proclamation of independence on the one hand, and the recognition of this independence by the Dutch and the international world much later on the other. It is both these processes and also the results of these processes that have been deeply examined in these two books. The structures of power shaping the different modes of revolution. The battle for the nation by the various groups was strongly influenced by the structures of colonial power in the different areas, which shuttled between diplomacy and warfare, where they had a military force and civil apparatus consisting of indigenous allies, which became a dilemma also for the Dutch colonial state, as this complicated their strategies to weaken the insurgents. But it also created a blurred line between allies and enemies. Already by 10 November 1945, the Dutch recognition of the need for diplomatic relations resulted in different responses by political figures such as Sukarno and Tan Malaka, which also highlighted the fact that Indonesian nationalism was not a linear process, but also intensified the political participation of the population, both at national and local level. The Dutch position regarding the creation of Indonesian regional states, for instance, the Negara Indonesia Timur, in 1948-1949, which to a certain extent was also seen as a means to counter the Java-based Indonesian Republic, ultimately resulted in an intensification of local competition between those who were for and against, and resulted in a reconfiguration of local power structures. Through these cases, we can also see that territorial borders are constantly in question, even until now. Important in all the chapters of both books are the different meanings given to the notion of revolution. This can be clearly seen in Onze Revolutie, where collective protest against existing colonial or local authorities can be interpreted by different groups as a coup d'etat, a counter-revolution, a guerrilla, or an active act of collective or individual violence. As a clear example is the discussion on the Peristiwa Tiga Daerah, which was a movement in Central Java aimed at the bureaucrats and local aristocrats. Various terms were used to refer to the protest actions depending on who the actor was, such as pemberontakan, revolt, penyelewengan, deviation, pergerakan, movement, or perjuangan, struggle, depending on who viewed or reported on them. Now about the different subjects or the actors involved. The varied structures of power in the different localities affected the involvement of the different subjects in the struggle against those in power, namely the Dutch colonialists, but also their allies, or who were considered their allies. The role of organizations representing the people can be seen in the ideological and political competition among the subjects representing those advocating the diplomatic approach, such as Sukarno and Hatta, and Shahrir, and those advocating a total revolution involving a mass action or armed struggle represented by Tan Malaka. We see the role of the youth, which has often been brought up in national commemorations, among others through the commemoration of Hari Sumpah Pemuda, as representing the national struggle. This generational category is much discussed in both books. The Indonesian Republic attempted to involve the youth either in the setting up of political parties or the Tentara Rakyat Indonesia, Indonesian People's Army, which also resulted in different alliances by the Indonesian Republic being made with the youth groups. But at the same time, as shown in one of the chapters of Revolutionary Worlds, who the Pemuda represented was difficult to determine, as they represented various groups from across the political spectrum, whether from the left-wing groups or the political parties established by the Indonesian Republic in the post-1945 period. We see the role of women through, among others, the organization Pemberontakan Rakyat Indonesia Putri, PRIP, PRIP, who were active not only in the public kitchens, which were not only places to provide food, but also to places to exchange information, but also as couriers in carrying letters to Jogja, in organizing political conferences and in rebellion movements to promote defense and security. The minorities, in this case, the Chinese and Indian minorities, represented a category that was seen differently in the specific areas. The case studies dealing with anti-Chinese violence during the revolutionary years show how the regional and historical context shaped how the position of the minority groups were seen. The violence against the Chinese could be more strongly seen in East Sumatra, whereas in West Sumatra they were kept isolated, and in Aceh the relations were seen as largely peaceful. The role of brokers can also be seen in the chapter highlighting the commercial character of a region where economic circumstances became fertile ground for brokering activities and where politics and economics came together around certain individuals or groups. After the proclamation of independence in 1945, following the fatwas of major ulama figures to join the war against colonialism and imperialism, many ulamas or religious teachers, including those in Jogja, organized the local communities through prayer groups and religious activities to follow the fatwas. Because of this, the Sultan sent an ambassador to Gunung Kidul to persuade the ulama there, especially because the area was ideal to initiate a guerrilla war against the Dutch. It is interesting to see the alliance between local aristocracy and Islamic leaders in the struggle for independence, which you wouldn't have thought about. Through all these diverse trajectories, we can see how these various actors were both united or separated by their diverse interpretations of nationalist ideologies and their varying ideas regarding the goals and the means of the revolution. So just as conclusion, as mentioned above, these two books are both highly important contributions to our knowledge of historical processes, as they examine carefully the complexities of power relations during the period between 1945 and 1949. What constitutes the nationalist narrative? How is it transformed through the position of different subjects in the diverse localities? But they also help our discussion regarding how nationalism and the revolutions should be seen within the historical context and the diverse trajectories these processes went through. A continuation of such endeavors should be made, particularly regarding the areas which have not been dealt with, as also mentioned in these books, such as Kalimantan and many islands in eastern Indonesia. What happens to the economic restructuring of local resources or class restructuring during and after the revolution? How do these political struggles affect the daily lives of those who were not involved in the struggles? And we would like to see more accounts of the subaltern groups, women, workers, peasants, during the period of these transformations. What we also have to think about is a reflection on the nature of historical sources. What type of sources provide what kind of information? And last but not least, I would like to thank all the authors and organizers who have worked extremely hard to produce these books, also in the context of often difficult public statements and debates regarding these topics. Thank you.
Very much, Ratna Saptari, for a wonderful, rich analysis, review. I would say the editors of the bijdrage of the BKI can basically publish your talk immediately. Thank you very much. Also showing that anthropology and history are not cousins but siblings. And also thanks to the gracious opening by the director of the KITLV, obviously. What is important, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, both in the room as well as those of you who are joining us on the live stream, is to immediately state that Revolutionary Worlds will also be translated into Bahasa Indonesia, and there will also be a program with the book launch in Indonesia. So it is definitely in the spirit of, one might say, these two volumes that the presentation will also take place in Indonesia. And it is my pleasure to be your host of this program. We will have a panel before the break, then two wonderful presentations from Revolutionary Worlds, a panel afterwards, and at the end of the program, as an audience, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So please take notes, mental notes or otherwise, because you will be given the opportunity to ask questions. Our esteemed colleague, Tom Hogevorst, will be there with the microphone. He will be holding the microphone and also will be able to translate in different languages. So if you're more comfortable asking your questions in either Dutch or Bahasa Indonesia, that is always possible because in this case, we have both a linguistic expert as well as a microphone expert in the room. But first, and without further ado, because we do have a very full program, I would like to ask the members of the first panel to join me on stage. So may I please ask Julianti, Irene Hogeboom, Bambang Purwanto, Abdul Wahid and Martijn Eickhoff to take your places. We have no assigned places, so please sit anywhere you want. And I will be actually standing here because otherwise you would constantly be looking to the side where I sit, and it's far more, well, conducive that you look to the audience in the room and to the people who are joining us on the live stream. So let me just briefly introduce, because they all have very impressive CVs, briefly introduce the panel. For left from my side is Professor Bambang Purwanto. He's a professor of history at Universitas Gadjah Mada, and he has been writing about Indonesian historiography, but also on many other topics in the past, and he's currently also doing very interesting research that we would have loved to talk about, but in the context of today's panel, perhaps during the break you can ask Professor Purwanto what he's writing about right now, but we will be asking him about his involvement in these volumes and in the projects. Next to him is Professor Martijn Eickhoff, Director of NIOD and endowed professor in Groningen, who will be delivering his inaugural speech somewhere in March. Professor Eickhoff has been a researcher who has been engaged in many fields, in the field of landscape, mass violence, remembrance, memory, and published with Professor Marieke Bloembergen, also in the audience, a wonderful book on archaeology in Indonesia. It's highly recommended. Get it through the library because it's published with an academic publisher. Next to him is Dr. Abdul Wahid, who is the head of the history department at UGM, also an established scholar, did his PhD in Utrecht on taxes. If I understand correctly, that book is now also translated in Bahasa Indonesia, right? So again, very important studies. Ms. Irene Hogeboom, he is the coordinator for the collaborative research on Indonesia and has been very much, and she has been applauded, rightfully so, for all her hard work in actually getting things done in this project, especially when it comes to these volumes. And last but definitely not least is Ibu Yulianti, also a lecturer at UGM. She now also teaches at a Center for Religious Studies at the graduate school, and she is both the editor of one of the editors of Revolutionary Worlds, as well as Onze Revolutie. And I will be asking you, let me just start by asking you a very simple question. Onze Revolutie immediately makes me think of Perjuangan Kita, Onze Strijd by Sultan Syahrir. Was that a deliberate choice to?
Yeah, I think it is very interesting to discuss that, and I think the decision to that is actually not only coming from me and also from Abdul Wahid, and also considering the content of the article that's actually we selected to be included in the volume. So we do really hope that the Onze Revolutie is actually able to reflect what is the article that we selected, and also that because of these articles are written from different period of time, so it's not on starting from the older generation and then moving on toward the younger generation who wrote the article. So we much more see it the spirit, how actually the idea of the revolution actually come into the spirit of different period.
Okay, thank you very much, and also thank you very much for including a chapter by one of my senior almarhum, Professor Richard Lairissa. I'm very thankful for that. Bambang, and I know all of the members of the panel, so please excuse me if I address them by their first name. That doesn't mean that I do not respect you enormously, obviously. But Bambang, as a specialist in the field of not only historiography, but you have been involved in many collaborative projects, including historians. So what do you think is the relevance of this collaboration? And please also elaborate how you consider what to be real collaboration between Indonesian and Dutch historians. What is the importance of this collaboration, where we have these books to thank for?
Thank you, Wim. I think this is a very, by my own experience, this is a very unique opportunity and also a unique experience as well for the project. But if you go through the title of the projects, you know, by adding the term of, you know, independence, that's really already answered all of your question. Because the original project without the word of independent. So you can see there was a dialogue here. Dialogue within the process of the research and also the dialogue, you know, in the article. So this I think this is really like a really a bridge, you know, to put together, you know, the Dutch. I'm the oldest, I think, among themselves, and then I have, you know, cooperated with a different generation, but Wahid and Yuli, you know, and others as well as a very, very young generation of Indonesian historian. And also, like you can see now, during that period, we had a very interesting dialogue.
Okay.
The first one is really the word of independence. We're putting in the word of independence is everything there. And you can see now, even the title of the books, it's not 1945, 1950, but 1945, 1949. So it's been a lot. Why we stop in 1949, not in 1950? That's mean a lot for Indonesia perspective. And also the word of decolonization. You know, we don't use it, the word decolonization, but we can understand, you know, the Dutch scholars, you know, use the term of decolonization. Most of the international scholars use the term of decolonization. But our concept is not decolonization, because Indonesia already decided politically that we are independent in 17 August 1945. So there was not the process of decolonization. But our friend from the Netherlands could accept that idea. So how does dialogue happen? That's, Wim, I think that's the most important, you know, during this cooperation.
Thank you, Bambang. And picking up on that, and obviously in the back, you see the stand by the publisher, Amsterdam University Press, Walburg Pers, where you can actually buy the books and perhaps get it signed by the authors and the editors, because many of them are in the room. Obviously, I'm not paid to do this commercial, but still. I would like to go on with Abdul Wahid. In the introduction of Revolutionary Worlds, it is stated that when we talk about cooperation and conversation and dialogue, Bambang already mentioned the word kedaulatan, independence was added, but it was also mentioned that Indonesian historians said, well, actually, we have our own research interest. There are other things that we feel to be important. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, thank you, Wim, for the questions. Indeed, as implies also from the previous explanation from Ratna as well. So basically, we are joining the program with our own agendas, indeed. So first of all, we can see that actually Indonesian historiography, especially about this period, is very much dominated by the state narrative. And then you can also see actually Indonesian historians, professional historians who really expert about this period is very limited in terms of numbers. So first we want to go beyond this state narrative, where we want to introduce to re-energize the interest of younger historians of Indonesia to do research about this period. And we really want to produce a new generation of historians, so to say. And that's, I think, what we have in mind, and that's why, indeed, we are a coordinator of the program, but for the project, we actually involved various young generation of historians from different universities in Indonesia. So, and 5 of them are already PhD, but the rest are still on the way to PhD. So we have like, for now at least, we have a 10 young Indonesian historian who is going to be an expert in this period. That's the first one. And the second, we also see that actually Indonesian historiography is very much inward-looking, considering this period. And we see that there is a need to broaden up, to push a little bit to more international engagement. So this is really the opportunity. And we have in mind that actually, maybe this is the opportunity that now or never. For the first time, because also we see that the generations of this period is passing in Indonesia. So we should do this now. And that we see also that there is happening new development in the Netherlands. There is a more open-minded development, and we see it as a big opportunity as well to push a dialogue with the Netherlands. So I think that's the most important thing. So I think we also want to do more than just beyond the political big names and the political process, but we want to understand actually what was happening in that period with the complexity of the processes, with the different situations and conditions in Indonesia. So basically we want to produce a more healthy historiography about this period.
Thank you. And actually that feeds back into what Hilmar Farid, who is of course not only the Director General of the Ministry of Culture, but also an eminent historian in Indonesia, wrote in his epilogue in Beyond the Pale, where he, for instance, admonished Dutch historians, saying you don't only have to look at Sejarah Nasional, but you have to look beyond Sejarah Nasional, right? And so, Juliante, coming back to you, because you, in especially Onze Revolutie, you start off with one of the founding fathers, one might say, of Indonesian historiography, Sartono, who was interested in processes, in structures, and not in, let's say, big man history. Was that a very deliberate choice of you to start off with that chapter?
Yeah, I think it's also to complement to the spirit of this project. I think where we actually cannot focus on the national narrative or some sort of like homogeneous perspective on a revolution. So we want to bring more on the social history of the revolution, and that's why we actually also manifest that spirit into how we actually select our researchers and also topics that are actually worked by our researchers on this revolutionary world. So I think the Onze Revolutie and also the revolutionary world are both two, I would see it as inseparable words, because the Onze Revolutie can be meant as an introductory work or of selected articles that people who have not really understand the broader context of the Indonesian Revolution can start with, and then zooming into the different cases of narrative on the revolution with the revolutionary world. So I think, that was, I think, as a deliberate choice of choosing Pak Sartono Gatotdijo as in the Onze Revolutie. Yeah.
Thank you.
And his work, I think, was one of the most important works to be included.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, you have to buy both books. I'm sorry. But Irene, we've heard comments from your Indonesian colleagues about the way they perceived and they entered the collaboration. And that, of course, also comes, especially looking back at the last couple of years with the pandemic, also comes with challenges. Could you briefly reflect on the process of collaboration?
Well, yes. Well, of course, the challenges were on different levels. I guess when we started off, we first actually needed to find each other also for how are we going to do this. And of course, the project, the sub-project Regional Studies is rooted in the larger research program. And started off with also a research agenda that was related to the larger research project, which was very much based on violence committed by Dutch military, but also violence in general. And KITLV was given this particular sub-project to cooperate with Indonesian scholars, because we have a long tradition in doing that. And then when we were trying to setting up this cooperation, we found out that, and I must admit, that it was naive, that this would be a totally different cooperation because of the theme than that what we had done before. So before, KITLV had projects which were always mixed projects, like NWO grants given with 2 Indonesians and 2 Dutch researchers, for instance, smaller projects on different themes. But this time, it was a total different situation, and we needed to find that out first. So when we, and luckily we had Pak Bang Bang, who made it clear in the first meeting that it would be totally different. But I think we first had to find each other, because we thought we can do a mixed project with a few, 3 Dutch researchers, 3 Indonesian researchers working on the same regions. Mm-hmm. And then, but after this meeting, discussing it, Bambang explained to us that, well, that is not going to work, because then either, if you want to do it with different perspectives, those perspectives cannot go together in one. So, and that totally set off another trajectory in finally having 2 projects with also different research agendas, because that's the second thing. We were still related to the larger research question, but for the Indonesian researchers, other questions were much more important. So then finally there were 2 projects with their own research agendas trying to find each other in working together, but doing that from different perspectives, and then trying, like, meeting each other at this bridge of the historiographies.
Then the bridge, and there will be an opportunity later in the program to ask questions. Please respect the protocol. You will be having an opportunity to ask those questions, but I would first like to, Irene, you're talking about the bridge, right? And then I would like to move on to Martijn, because you have been involved in many research projects with Indonesian colleagues. And I would like to ask you, what for you was special or innovative, new about this particular sub-project? I would say there's nothing well, it also talks about subalterns, but it's a wonderful project. What was the new thing or the innovative thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my first project in Indonesia dates from 12 years ago, and I was reflecting with Marieke Bloemberg, who's here, and also Susanne Schienne, how can you do this? And I think it's a principle that, which is a post-colonial principle. You cannot just go there and do research. That is something you don't want, and it's also very difficult to organize on a practical level. So it should be part of an exchange process. There should be one-level collaboration, and that's when you are able to organize that, a very enriching experience in which you, of course, also discuss inequalities, which are still there. But that is exactly where you can find each other when you express the problems you encounter. So in that sense, the project was similar to what I've done, and for me that was also a precondition, otherwise I wouldn't have joined this group. I knew that Indonesia has a very rich historical culture beyond the official state narrative. So when you go to sites, when you talk to people, you learn a lot. And I think that was one of the things we wanted to do in this project. What was very different is the scale. When I did research in the past, I think it was always a group of six or nine people. And now it were almost 30 people, I think. Here. There were always large groups like this. And that helped us to develop new ways of comparison. So normally, especially when you talk about the era of the revolution, and you look at the region, people compare to what happened in the center. That is already something. But now we were in the position to compare what happened in the east and the west of the archipelago, and totally new dynamics came up. So I think that was really crucial. It could have been more, the scale could level up, but I think this was doable for us. And maybe I can tell one anecdote. Wahid organized an excursion to the Ambarawa monument. And Roel and I, we actually, sorry Roel for saying this, but we weren't really aware what this monument was commemorating. Whereas in Indonesian historiography, it's one of the main battles. And then later I found out in the Dutch historiography, they say it wasn't a battle, the English withdraw. So the Indonesians celebrate the battle, which others see as a withdrawal. And then you can say who is right, who's wrong. But what I learned is to ask the question, why do people see this in a different way? And then you can start the discussion. So it was a very, although I didn't really like the Suharto style monument, to be honest, but it was a very inspiring collaboration.
Thank you for also bringing out an example of what you have been doing in this collaboration. And of course, Wahid, you also already mentioned that you are now building a new generation of historians that can continue the work towards the future. And then, of course, language always comes up, and his name has been mentioned already, and he's sitting on the second row. Taufik, where are... Taufik. Oh, Taufik is... Oh, here. You were important because you translated, right? And so I just want to ask you, in this... Yes, we have to be consistent. Even though you're colleagues, Tom has the microphone. No, but what I would like to ask you, because many of these terms in this whole conversation are, of course, very contested, loaded, so to say. And so how did you manage, or how did you approach this issue of translation?
Wonderful question, Tim. Hi, Jeffrey. I wanted to give my answer in Bahasa Indonesia, but then everybody else would understand, save Jeffrey, so I might as well just say it in English. So I remember it was exactly like 6 years ago when Iran knocked on my door, and she wanted me to translate the proposal, the initial proposals of the Odhoi research. And you were correct that there was the word independence in it. It was only geweld and dekolonisatieonderzoek, geweld and oorlog. And then eventually it was changed that independence was included in later on the research projects. And terminologies were always loaded. And I was so accustomed that in previous texts, for example, the two great offenses in Indonesia committed by the Dutch were almost always called as polisional actie or actie politie. But then in my school years, I never actually recognized the two terms. It was always considered to be agresi militer 1 dan 2 in 1947 and 1948. And I thought it was... Persis. Sweet. And so that's how I was taught in schools, because I actually went to Indonesian schools, and I think it was a very personal experience. And then I was exposed to these new terms here. And somehow the two terminologies were, like you said earlier, was very loaded, because Indonesia considered that to be aggressions from one sovereign state against another sovereign state. And that is dangerous for the Dutch audience or the Dutch servicemen or former military men, because that would make them the war criminals, right? So they resort to euphemisms, and there are tons of euphemisms in the Dutch text. But then later on, I think they embraced this awareness that Wahid mentions. So they would incorporate two terms and let the nuances and the complexities to be present. So I think on the parts of both Indonesian researchers and the Dutch researchers, bridging the narratives actually work really well. Just like Pak Bambang said earlier, the dialogue took place, and messages got across. So that's the answer I have.
And you definitely contributed to that, so thank you very much. And the search for a common vocabulary is, of course, always important, not only when it comes to concepts, but also when it comes to words. And I'm now also looking at the clock. We have a very tight schedule, and I don't want to prevent you from getting some coffee and tea or going to the bathroom. So I would propose, even though I could understand, we could talk for yet another hour, but then our second wonderful panel could not be on the stage, and we would be chased out of the museum. And so I would propose that we break for a brief, let's say, I would say 10 minutes, but I think with 160 people in the room, that's hardly feasible. Let's say 15 to 20 minutes, and then we return to have two wonderful case studies from revolutionary worlds. But first, join me in a big hand for our first panel. Eén vraag. Very good, Taufik. Very good. Terima kasih ya. Terima kasih. Bagus. Ja. Geachte aanwezigen, Bapa, Ibu, dear audience, would you please return to your seats because we will continue our program. Ja, Evelien. Bapak Ibu yang terhormat, kita akan mau mulai kembali dengan lanjutkan acara kita. Bukan saja revolusi kita, tetapi acara kita. Please return to your seats. Bapak Ibu, kita akan lanjutkan acara kita. I feel like I'm a Fendusiemeester, but please return so we can continue our program. because and prior to the break we had two wonderful introductions and a very thought-provoking, rich panel, but I can understand, and I already saw some of you walking with the books, and you will be the lucky ones, but because I'm pretty sure that the books will be sold out. And so buying the books now is very wise. But of course, everyone is very curious about the content of especially revolutionary worlds. And we are very lucky that we have two researchers that will present their findings before we go on to the second panel. And the first presenter is Mrs. Apriani Harahap, who is who is a lecturer of history at the Faculty of Social Science, the University of Medan. And yes, please give her a warm welcome. And Apri, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Playing it safe.
Thank you, Wim. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I will begin by explaining playing itself, survival strategy of the Indian community in East Sumatra cities 1945 until 1946. Please take a look at my presentation. One of the many ethnic communities in Sumatra that were heavily affected by the conflict and uncertainty during the Indonesian Revolution was the Indian. Largely overlooked in Indonesia historiography, they have been seen mainly as the sort of regret that British drew of for their occupation of Java and Sumatra at this time. This research broadens the focus of examine the impact the regime transition had on Indian community in East Sumatra cities. For the Indian community in East Sumatra, the early period of Indonesian independence was not a pleasant one. Many of them had early been contract workers in plantation belt and belonging to the lower classes. Their colonial status as foreign Easternists, however, had placed them above the continuous marginalized indigenous people. Accordingly, the presence of Indian soldiers in the British Army made all civilian Indian in East Sumatra look like colonial stages in the eye of indigenous Indonesian. It led to dread again the Indian community in East Sumatra. The research question, what was their strategy for survival amid the social unrest that lasts from August 1945 to November 1946? The flow of Indian migrants to East Sumatra began in the late 19th century when European entrepreneurs were establishing tobacco plantations. The first migrants were Tamil. They were as contract laborers and plantation. When some of the tobacco plantations switched to rubber and oil palm, many Tamils began unemployed. But they did not immediately return to their country of origin. Instead, they moved to nearby urban neighborhoods. Meanwhile, new economy migrants arrived from India, mostly Sikh, Chettiar, and Sindhi. The 1930 census recorded 13,912 Indians. 67% of whom resided in village near plantation concession. The remaining 33% were spread across the 5 main cities in East Sumatra. The Dutch divided the Indian in East Sumatra into 4 categories: Keling, Chetty, Bengali, and Bombay. Together with the Chinese and Arab, many Indians enjoy the privilege of being middle class in the colonial social stratification. As foreign Easternists, their social status was higher than the average Bumiputra. Their social status reduced the interaction with the other social group, a zoning system forced foreign externals to live in special residency location. When it came to politics, Indian in Sumatra oriented themselves toward their place of origin, India. This attitude became more apparent under Japanese colonialism. The Japanese built up the cooperation with the Indian trader and supported the establishment of the Indian Independence League, or IIL, in Medan. The Indian traders saw this as an opportunity to liberate India. By 1943, 7 IL branch offices had been set up in neighboring cities. Chaired mostly by traders, this branch office mobilized India community in their cities to take part in the Indian independence movement with the help of Japan. In mid-1943, the IL began recruiting young Indians to serve the Indian National Army, INA. In 7 waves of recruitment, the IL managed to enlist a great number of young Tamils and Sikhs. In late 1943, the first 4 batch of recruits totaling 150 personnel were deployed to Burma to fight the British. The 5th to 7th batch, however, were never dispatched. By 1945, many had left the INA. The euphoria of independence began to overwhelm East Sumatra in early September 1945. On 3 October 1945, Governor Hassan officially appointed Republican government operator for East Sumatra Residency. The situation began to change when British troops landed in Medan on 10 October 1945. However, the British only had a limited number of troops and their authority was confined to Medan. Outside Medan, therefore, the British cooperated with local authorities of the Republic of Indonesia to maintain security and order. Indonesian youth who had belonged to the Heiho and the Gyugun soon took advantage of the leeway to form the People's Security Army, Tentara Keamanan Rakyat, or TKR. However, TKR was quickly left behind by the rapid emergence of several non-insurgent groups founded in common ethnicity or unresident location. But TKR and militia fighter confiscated weapons and ammunition from the Japanese soldiers. This armed group engaged in a series of skirmishes with the British and Indian troops from late November 1945 onward. The early days of Indonesian independence were marked not only by the struggle against the British and Dutch, but also by intergroup conflict. The new Republican government apparatus in East Sumatra were not yet equipped to gain full control over the region. They were under constant pressure from armed groups who fought not only against the British and the Dutch, but also among themselves for territorial control and economic research. The British and Dutch prison, meanwhile, keep the Republic government from function effectively. In second extreme predicament, small conflict could indeed easily escalate into major violence. The Indian community in East Sumatra respond to the revolutionary situation in 3 ways. The youth play an active role in Indonesia's struggle to maintain independence. Some of them joined the Indonesian militia, especially from members of the Indian National Army. The coast and personally approached Indian soldiers to defect to the Republic. There were at least 71 deserters in Medan alone, most of them Muslim Indian soldiers. Indian youth solidarity for the Indonesian cause became more apparent as social political organization emerged from mid-1946 onwards. The Indonesia Union, the Sumatran Youth Institute for New Democracy, the Institute of Indian Union, and the Committee of Indonesia-Chinese Indian Union. The social political organization supported Indonesia independence. Wealthy merchants, by contrast, supported the British and Dutch effort to establish colonial rule. Others demand this group to be opportunists who took side only for their own economic gain. Even amid the chaos, the men had profit by smuggling basic needs. Other Indians in Sumatra were not interested in the conflict between Indonesia and the Dutch and chose to remain neutral, minding their own business. There were significant variation in both the temporal and spatial context, the violence that the community faced. Violent act against the Indian trader in Medan, surrounding urban areas began in late 1945, especially after the arrival of the British Army. Many of them were Indian soldiers. As conflict between the British Army and Indonesia fighter escalated, act of violence against Indians extended beyond Medan from the early months of 1946. Terror, threat, and robberies were directed against Indians, not only business owners, but also Indian commoners living outside Medan. The presence of Indian soldiers in British Army in East Sumatra contributed to escalation of threat the Indian community. The Indian troops were considered colonial accomplices by Indonesians. The Indian civilians were moreover suspect of supporting to the return Dutch rule. Acts of violence can also be traced the lasting Indonesian perception of the Indian in Sumatra as foreigners. The residency segregation based on race first imposed by the Dutch and continued by the Japanese military government exacerbate the social separation between Indonesia and ethnic Indians. Violent experience by Indians in Sumatra also had an international dimension, in part original from the internal political constellation in India. The Indian Muslim League's demand to partition India into two nations, Pakistan and India, had been rejected by the Hindu politicians from the Indian National Congress, and the resulting tensions sparked major clash between Hindu and Muslim groups in 1946, which in turn led to the anti-Hindu sentiment among the Muslim British soldiers from India who had joined Indonesian militias. Acts of violence against Sumatra Indians were not only perpetrated by the Indonesian youth and militia. Indian soldiers, especially Muslim soldiers, who deserted from the British Indian Army, were also involved in robbery and attack on Indian civilians. It is not known how many Indians fell victim to the violence and raids. However, the number of those who fled to Medan reached almost 2,000 people. The Indian community in Sumatra was heavily affected by the conflict and uncertainty that overwhelmed Indonesia in the early days of its independence. The multidimensional character of this event forced the Indian community to create their own strategy to set themselves free from the entanglement of revolutionary complexity. The violence made life more miserable for many Indians in Sumatra. It forced them to flee to Medan in hope getting protection from the British Indian troops. Other Indians, especially the youth, resorted to different strategies to avoid stigmatization, distrust, and hostility. The demonstration their commitment and loyalty to the Republic of Indonesia and fought together with Indonesia freedom fighters. They did especially by utilizing social politician organizations that supported Indonesia independence and thwarted that plan to re-establish their colonial power in Indonesia. In November 1946, the interim Indian government sent two ships to transport 3,000 Indians seeking repatriation to India. They chose to return to the homeland to set themselves free from turbulent times and multi-dimensional conflict in East Sumatra, the land that had blessed them for the last few decades. Last slide. The research presents the Indian community as new actor in the historical studies of Indonesian Revolution. This research also broadened the focus of the study on the experience of minority group during the Indonesian Revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Apriani, for a wonderful presentation on a history that I think many of us did not know or knew little about. And you will be joining us later in the panel, so I can ask you some additional questions, obviously. But next, I would like to give the floor to Anne van der Veer, who will present her research. And Anne is now a software engineer, always very impressive, but has also engaged in deep historical research. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wim, for this introduction. Thank you all for listening to this presentation, and thank you, Apriani, for well, having the nerve to precede me, and to also perhaps introduce the region of East Sumatra and the city of Medan to all of you. Because in this presentation, I would like to focus more on the some of the set of sources that form the basis of my, my contribution to revolutionary worlds. One of the crucial sources for my contribution has a telling quote I would like to share with you. So it says, it's from a Chinese association that will be introduced in this presentation. It says, at present, although it's still difficult to infer how the local situation will develop, we know one thing for certain. In the end, the development will not be as before. It says a lot, I guess, this quote, and avoids to saying a lot, but we'll get there in a minute. So in East Sumatra, in the period immediately following the capitulation of Japan on 15 August 1945, was marked by uncertainty over who was to rule Indonesia. The Republic of Indonesia had been proclaimed in Jakarta on 17 August 1945 by Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta. And the Republican officials for the province of Sumatra were officially appointed. However, little headway was made in the concrete establishment of this state in East Sumatra. And in the spirit of uncertainty, tensions arose between Chinese and Indonesians. For example, the news circulated that it would be the Chinese army who would be among the allied forces coming to Indonesia. And in several towns across East Sumatra, like Medan and Pematang Siantar, clashes happened between Chinese people and Indonesian people around 15 September 1945. Indonesian commentators give a telling account of the situation. At this very disquieting moment, at the time when it was still uncertain who was to rule Indonesia, after the Japanese surrender, as if only to increase the worries in the hearts of the Indonesian people, the Chinese population, especially the Kuomintang group that ruled China at the time, hailed the new situation as its own victory, as China was one of the allied nations coming out of the war as a victor. This quote is taken from the book you see here presented. It's written by the Bureau Sejarah Prima, standing for the Pejuang Republik Indonesia Medan area. So the fighters for the Republic of Indonesia in Medan region. And they established their historical bureau to keep track of their own documents and accounts. And they published this book, Medan Area Mengisi Proklamasi, Perjuangan Kemerdekaan dalam Wilayah Sumatera Utara. Medan area fills up the proclamation, the independence struggle in North Sumatra in 1976. So this it's an important book also because of the authors of this book. The editorial team was led by a prominent journalist called Mohammed Said. He was the chief editor of one of the first independent newspapers in Medan, and also military commander Nip Sarim, who was one of the founders of the Tentara Keamanan Rakyat in East Sumatra. So they were both key witnesses of the revolution and key actors, and also left this book for us to give insight into their experiences and also of their analysis of the situation. And it's one of the crucial books that Apriani, who just spoke, and her colleagues at the Universitas Negeri Medan showed me when I was visited there for the first time. So in this book is also mentioned a statement issued by Chinese organizations in response to the confrontations happening. And this statement was presented in a pamphlet, and this pamphlet was is called Manuhutu. Oh, next one. This is the pamphlet, actually. It's called Manuhutu Persatuan Tionghoa Indonesia, Seruan Pihak Bangsa Tionghoa, towards Chinese-Indonesian unity, an appeal from the Chinese people, and it was issued in Medan on 17 September 1945. A copy of this document was confiscated by the Netherlands Foreign Intelligence Service, the NIMH, and taken to the Netherlands and is now available in the National Archive in The Hague. It's called a confiscated document. It's and we can read the original copy and the translation produced by the NIMH. So there's a lot in this pamphlet. First, the statement, it reads as follows. China, they want to express their own perspectives to the Indonesian audience. China is a peace-loving country and has no intention for colonizing Indonesia or influencing politics in Indonesia. The government of China itself is founded on the right of self-determination and therefore naturally agrees and sympathizes with the independence of Indonesia. Overseas Chinese in Indonesia are a guest and not a big brother, and do not intend to come into conflict with the Indonesian people. And finally, overseas Chinese only hope to help the development of Indonesia in economic domain. But besides these statements, very clearly, the documents also gives insight into contemporary discussions and tensions concerning the position of the Chinese in East Sumatra and also the way in which they identify themselves. So several key terms and phrases used in this document give us an idea of the larger issues at stake, namely the lack of understanding between Chinese and Indonesian and a lot of miscommunication. So they use the word salamingati or misunderstanding. So, and also uncertainty among Indonesians about the position of the Chinese in the context of the confusing power constellation at this very early stage of the revolution and the situation immediately after independence. And the Chinese attitudes towards independence. And also feelings of national pride and racial pride also among Chinese that was perceived by Indonesians. On the other hand, also an aspect of international and interracial solidarity and shared understandings of self-determination, independence and anti-colonialism that was shared between the two populations. And finally, a lack of integration is visible from the source of Chinese people in East Sumatra into local society. The Chinese still present themselves as brothers, saudara, of Indonesians and as guests in Indonesia. And the majority of Chinese in Medan and East Sumatra identify themselves as in Indonesian perantau Tionghoa or in Mandarin huachao, in English sojourners or overseas Chinese. So they have very strong ties to the country of origin. Only a small minority identified themselves as Peranakan or local born. So these identifications return in later sources, but it helps to understand how people express themselves. So the pamphlet helped to reconcile the situation in September 1945. However, a new cycle of confrontations started around 10 October when Allied forces and also two Dutch-led parties arrived in East Sumatra. Indonesian historiography marks this period as the beginning of the battle for Medan, the struggle of Indonesian military forces and youth brigades to defend Medan against Dutch recolonization. While at the same time, a rash of burglaries occurred over the ensuing months, and Chinese residents in Medan were targeted especially. So in this context, Chinese organizations, among whom the organizations who signed this pamphlet, convened a mass meeting in Medan on 9 December 1945. and thereby established the Chinese General Association, or Huajiao Zhongwei, or in Indonesian, Gabungan Kumpulan Tionghoa Persatuan. Perantahan, excuse me. So this is also a document that ended up in the National Archive as confiscated document. These are the founding documents of the meeting and contain outlines of organization, a list of members, in total 48 organizations and 46 individuals. It's a large, it's a federation of organizations, this association. And a massive manifesto that was quoted at the beginning of this presentation. And in this manifesto, I also present an analysis of the situation and how to deal with it. So it reads as follows. The difficult position of the overseas Chinese at this moment is known to everybody. If we look for the reasons, they are more or less as follows. Political problems of the local government have not yet obtained a satisfactory solution. The government of our country has not yet been able to execute its duty of protecting the Chinese fully. The local government is unsuccessful in giving overseas Chinese an all-right security. And we can see the constellation of local and home countries. And as time goes on, conditions will become worse and life more miserable. Under such a crisis, in which the overseas Chinese must plan for their own safety, the existence of the Chinese General Association in Medan is just a matter of course. And so, in order to address the lack of protection, members of the Chinese General Association collectively decided to make a number of appeals for protection to the Republican authorities and also leaders of various Indonesian struggle groups, to the Allied forces in Medan, and also to President Chiang Kai-shek of the Chinese national government. However, as indicated by the final statement of the manifesto, there was little to expect from these appeals, as neither local or homeland authorities were able to provide all-right protection to the Chinese in Medan. So in this context, the members decided to raise their own security guard to lend assistance to the upholding public order in cooperation with the Indonesian police to provide protection to the Chinese residents in Medan. On 13 December 1945, a call for recruits was published in the local Chinese newspapers, both Chinese language and Indonesian language, for a Chinese security guard. One of the individual representatives of the Chinese General Association, Lim Seng, was called as president. So this Chinese Security Corps, or Pengawal Keamanan Tionghoa, or Po Antui, or Bo Andui in Chinese, plays a large role in addition to the Chinese General Association. So there's a lot to say about what happened next when these Chinese Security Corps joined the fray in Medan. So how Chinese security guards made their appearance in the streets of Medan, while fighting was already going on between Indonesian youth brigades and Allied forces, when burglaries were rampant. There's much to say about the escalating clashes between Chinese guards and Indonesian youth brigades. There's much to say about attempts at reconciliation of members of the Chinese General Association and other political organizations, social organizations. There's much to say about internal discussions within the Chinese community and also the General Association, and how eventually the General Association refused to take responsibility any longer for the security corps, as it became too confrontational in trying to protect Chinese. And finally, leading up to a major split within Chinese society. There's much to say about the cooperation of the security corps with the Dutch military forces when the Dutch took over command from the Allied forces. And there's much to say about the open criticism of the General Association on the actions of the security corps and their attempts to build relations with Indonesian people instead. But as we're still here in December 1945, everything was still possible, and the Chinese security guards were an independent organization in their own right, and pretty anti-colonial as well. But in the final account, we can infer from the conclusions of the historians of the Bureau Sejarah Prima that reads as follows. So tragically, I read it from here. Tragically, a pattern of thought emerged among the majority of the Chinese people, especially in Medan area, that the national struggle of the Indonesian youth was taken over by mere criminals. But conversely, a pattern of thought emerged among the Indonesian people that the Chinese security corps was a mere tool of colonialism, aiming to undermine even the independence of the Indonesian people. And these two conflicting mindsets were very much alive when the physical revolution was completed. This severely damaged the possibilities for cooperation between the two sides, which in the end only benefited colonialism. And I would like to end here. And if you can find in the book, or maybe ask me if you want to learn more, and I help you to other authors who know more about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for yet another fascinating story, bringing together the local, the national, and the international. Please, don't leave the stage. Take a seat. Apri, please join us on the stage. Bambang, Abdul Wahid, Jerry, Roel, please join us on the stage for our second panel. And there, again, there is no preferred room. You're all visible to our audience in the live stream, so that is covered, so to say. And I would like so I would like to start with the two wonderful presenters, because you both presented local histories that were intertwined with international political constellations, because we tend to sometimes forget that, of course, the War of Independence took place in post-war Asia, where China emerged and India also emerged as independent countries. And even though in Bandung, the representatives of China were another republic than in 45, so to say, the ones that you mentioned, Anne, but one might say Nehru, Zhou Enlai, Sukarno, they were all there in Bandung in 55, obviously. I would like to start with you, Apri, if I may. You did your research, and Anna was talking a lot about sources, sumber. So what about the sources that you could use? Were these written sources, people who might still be alive, memoirs perhaps?
May
bisa.
I speak Indonesia?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm so sorry. Sumber saya yang dapatkan itu dari koran-koran lokal tahun 45 sampai 50 seperti Berjuang, Kedaulatan Rakyat, kemudian Suluh Merdeka, and then Arsip Nevis, and then saya mencarinya dari perpustakaan nasional Andri, dan juga di Yogyakarta, Ignatius, dan tentunya di Medan. Dan saya juga mewawancarai salah satu veteran orang India dan juga orang India sipil seperti Nyonya Sarjitur, orang Sikh yang salah satunya mendukung dalam kategori netral, tidak tahu menahu tentang revolusi.
Okay, thank you very much. So you used local newspapers,
yeah.
Also archives, including the Nevis archive, that of course contains many sources and documents that were taken, yeah, from opponents of the Dutch. Obviously, you looked into the National Archives, the ANRI also a rich repository of sources and also the different libraries that you used. And you did oral history. So what was your experience when you interviewed these elderly people? Were they very enthusiastically talking to you, or were they a bit hesitant? Bagaimana sebenarnya sikap daripada narasumber yang diwawancarai Apri?
Kebanyakan kalau India Tamil apresiasi mau diwawancarai, tetapi pedagang-pedagang Sikh Chetty tidak mau dan nggak tahu alasannya kenapa, dan ada juga dapat salah satu perempuan Sikh umur 80-an itu, dia sangat memberi informasi yang sangat berguna untuk saya.
Okay, so you had different experiences depending sometimes on ethnicity, but sometimes also people came forward, and this is, I think, a very good reminder of the fact that we need to be specific if we talk about groups of people, right? That it is always too easy to say, oh, well, all the so-and-so. And then this brings me also to Anne. Anne, you in your presentation, where you focused also on the source material, showed that there were different positions of different groups of people of Chinese descent, be they what used to be called Totok Chinese or Peranakan Chinese, people with a long history in Indonesia, yes or no. So were you still able to also include oral history, so interviews with people who were saksi sejarah, so to say?
Yeah, it's a good question. We try to do interviews in Medan and Pematang Siantar and other towns. We could see, but it's maybe outside of this presentation, there was a big difference between Medan and Pematang Siantar. And Medan was marked by a very controversial history of, because of the Chinese security corps in Medan. But on the other hand, the town of Pematang Siantar was a regional revolutionary capital, to which also the Republican officials fled when Medan was taken over by the Dutch. And we see in Siantar that the relationships between Chinese and Indonesians was much better, and also people, especially Chinese people, were much happier to talk, because they were also, well, maybe proud of what happened during the revolution. So there are also regional differences, but in that extent. And they also, the communities helped, if they could not remember themselves because they were already too old, helped me to locate sources they still had themselves, and also commemorative volumes, because they all keep the history alive themselves, and they introduced me to their own local sources.
So in that case, in your research, you found out that communities are their own archives and libraries, yes, and they keep this history alive themselves.
Yes.
That's very important to hear. Yes. And so this brings me to Abu Wait and Roel as part of the editorial team. Right, in the introduction, and we both just had two wonderful presentations on, well, one might say underrepresented histories. But you also talk in the introduction, and this is I think a very good thing, about the limitations of revolutionary worlds. You use the plural, and that has been explained. You couldn't do all, and perhaps that is something for the future. Both when it comes to communities, you name several communities. I would definitely would have added very explicitly people of Moluccan descent. But you also mentioned that also when it comes to the regional spread, you were limited. So how did you deal with those limitations? Did you both say, well, you know, this is just how it is, and let's keep that for the future, or were there hard decisions to make? How to use basically resources also?
Yes, thank you for the questions. Indeed, ideally, our book, it could cover the entire archipelago, the entire areas of Indonesia, which is, of course, it's impossible, simply impossible. Indonesia is such a vast island, vast archipelago, sorry, such a vast country. And we have also, as you might also know, that Indonesian society is very plural, and there are many different groups of society, ethnicity, religious group, or political interests, ideology, etc., etc. And this is something we have in mind actually, and we did our best, we tried our best to represent the complexity of the stories. But yeah, the limitations came. We felt the limitation. Part of them is it's hard to find, for example, reliable Indonesian researcher from the entire part of Indonesia, or the entire university. And so we have to make really selection, and then, you know, well, at least we try to cover the most important, you know, areas. And then that's the first limitations. Of course, we have these difficulties in covering the entire geographical areas. The second one, of course, the COVID, the COVID-19, sorry, the pandemic, which has prevented actually many of our researchers to access data, archives, and especially interview the elder people from these generations, because which is simply impossible. But we are very glad to see that actually most of our researchers managed to do that, as you can see from the case of Apriani. Although it's not really, you know, maximum in terms of numbers, for example, but it can really tell the story. That what we are very happy to have this kind of, you know, cases or example of from the local dynamic or from the regions. And yes, indeed, with this in mind, we have set this as our future agenda, of course. And for that reason, actually, we initiated the extra project, so to say, additional project. So we have a PhD student who work on the Arab communities in Central Java, which is also very important and very interesting cases. Also from you know, business community of Tobago somewhere. But that's we call it additional, and we will feature this additional project together with. We have also 9 master students who are working on their thesis about the project. So maybe that's for another publication from our project. Because for the first project, we are really focusing on this revolutionary war, and we have set that for several years. And the third year, we come up with these new ideas that we have to, you know, initiate additional project just to fill in the gap, Win. And so. But yeah, of course, the additional project will be published mostly in Bahasa Indonesia. But who knows, if the KITLV will fund it, we will translate it into English.
Yes.
If necessary.
That's very good. Thank you very much. So next to you is Roel Fracking, and I immediately addressed you with Roel because we know each other. But of course, not everyone does. Everyone perhaps should. Roel Fracking is a lecturer of political history at Utrecht University, and has also been engaged in this particular project. He did his PhD in the European University in Firenze, right?
Yeah,
yes,
correct.
So that's always a good thing. But Roel, also as part of the editorial team, not only talking about the limitations, but also about the potential. And so Waid also already said, well, there will be future research projects that are basically based upon this work that has been going on. How do you feel in that respect? Do you see that same potentiality, and then also in the sphere of cooperation?
Good questions all. Well, first in terms of potentialities, of course, as we've amply showed, is that we've unearthed a lot of new materials and sources and so on, and different ways of looking at sources that we've had at our disposal for some time now. On the other hand, also, yeah, I think what Revolutionary World has done is that because we spoke about revolutionary worlds, plural, which means that basically the concept that we've thought up all together in terms of, yeah, we'd like to think that there are multiple revolutions, which means for us that conceptually it really makes sense to disaggregate what this revolution was about and really hone in on the local dynamics and what kind of agency was involved with that. So we look at every day, like how would you say, we look at political parties, we look at individuals, and we look at all kinds of parties that were really engaged in thinking about what Merdeka was and how you express those notions into very tangible actions. So for us, we always thought about multiple revolutions, and I think as a concept, this is a very promising mode of thinking about such periods, not only in terms of Indonesia, but maybe also in terms of other similar conflicts in that sense. And also, I don't know if you talk about limitations and prospects. I also feel that we've shown that, you know, this book obviously has a very, or not a very, but a limited period of time that it really engages with. And if you talk about limitations, there's some things are in that sense maybe underrepresented, as in we don't need to, I mean, the point of where we are now is at this revolutionary period, if you follow that. And then I always wonder what happens if you take more longer perspectives. And if you do that, you will see, and this is now a little bit out of the picture when you only look at 1945, 1949, is how ubiquitous was the violence of empire as a system. So I feel that the new frontier of research should really look in that direction, because then you also see the entrenched nature of who was all implicit in this. Because in our book, obviously, if you only look on the actions of Dutch soldiers, for example, you miss how other groups were implicated in empire as well. Educators in the spheres of law, but also, you know, bankers and planters and so on and so forth. And I feel that this book offers the opportunity to kind of also not only look at this particular period, but also reminds us of the fact that the work is not done, and we should perhaps also incorporate much more long-term perspectives. Because lastly, and sorry then the point here is as well that if you only look at 1945, 1949, or a bit longer, you might come away with the idea that, oh, this revolution was some kind of an explosion that came out of nowhere, which is obviously not the case at all. And if you take longer perspective into consideration, you also see the nationalist movement. It was much more entrenched and intense, but you also see that the resistance against occupation has very, very long traditions and genealogies. So I think this is a new, or not necessarily new, but a necessary context for future research, I feel.
Thank you. And in that respect, again, referring to Sartono Kadodejo's piece in Onze Revolutie, talks about these long-term processes. Yep. That brings me to Jerry van Klinken, an experienced and acclaimed scholar on many things that pertain to the Indonesian archipelago. Jerry, you are also part of the editorial team. And of course, as a senior researcher, you might come across, you might come to a certain stage where you see things and you remember, okay, this has been done before. So as a part of this editorial team of Revolutionary Worlds, what was surprising, new, perhaps also running counter to what you thought was going on, and new research brought that out?
Surprising, new. I did come into the project a bit later, but what struck me is the degree of personal involvement in the project when you think this is something that happened more than 70 years ago. It's a lifetime ago. And yet people opened themselves to something in that story that gripped them. On the Dutch side, I see younger historians, maybe like Roel, who have come out of a tradition where the revolution is seen as primarily a period of chaos, fascist youth, perhaps hit up by the Japanese military, committing random acts of violence, and discovering that there's actually more to the revolution than that. that there was something emancipatory in there. Also, the idea that our wonderful archives, kilometers of them here in Den Haag, are not the only way of reading this revolution. The other, on the Indonesian side as well, I saw a confidence and a maturity in the younger historians that really did surprise me as well. A confidence that the revolution still has this emancipatory theme. I've seen no revisionism about the revolution, that this was really, you know, a bad idea from the start. But a maturity because they don't feel compelled to repeat the same narrative with which they have been brought up in the with historians from the New Order period, but to break through and listen to break into themes that have actually been taboo for a long time. This story that Apriani brought us of dealing with minorities is really something new. You don't portray people who have a problem with the revolution in your national history. And yet, you know, the Indians, the ethnic Chinese, the ethnic Ambonese, the Christians, the Indo-Europeans were always seen as, well, sort of dubious. So to have a group, have a researcher like Apriani, who's not Indian, she's not coming from the Indian family, she reached out to the Indian community and learnt what it was like for them. I think that's really remarkable. Of course, Anna has done the same. She's not Chinese. She learnt Chinese, and she's thinking her way into it. These two things, for me, quite remarkable.
Thank you. And then I always lead to Bambang, and also in this case. But what would you say, Bambang? And please, then I would like to ask everyone in this particular panel to chip in, especially those of you who teach. What is the teaching potential of revolutionary worlds? Because there's new research there. There's a lot of young researchers doing work that hasn't done before. And, you know, Jerry has this encyclopedic knowledge about what goes on in the research field. So if he says it's new, it's probably new. So what is the potential for education? And, you know, that could be education to students, but also to perhaps schools, be they, you know, secondary schools or whatever. So Bambang, could you please kick off, and then I would like to hear from the others before we go to the Q&A.
Thank you, Wim. This is hard, you know, to answer because I'm not part of the who working on the history education. But one point I would like to mention here that this is really part of the process of the development of Indonesian historiography. And I love to see it before I retired in the next few years, that the young generation already, you know, already create something. The new generation already there. So, I mean, you know, what Apri has done is a very interesting because there was no such, you know, information. It's not only for the, what do you call it, history education at the SMP or SD or SMR, but also for the university student. So this kind of new emerging historiography, it's really, I think it will contribute a lot. You know, now we are already on the age of the information technology and how the people create something like this, and how they're using history as well. It become, I mean, all of this done by the young, I can say a younger historian is incredible. You know, one thing, for example, now I would like to put it together with kind of resources to edit what Apri has done. One information, for example, when we are talking about Padang, the article about Padang, you know, that's a very interesting, because we, in fact, we have a lot of information, you know, stored by the Chinese community in that area. So we have the original, you know, really original sources. And also you can see something, we never talked about this before. I mean, the way that we talk about the what do we call it, you know, the kind of the pokers, those who are Christian, you know, the Christian Bumi Putra, you can see something like that, you know, and we didn't really have this kind of information. But what interesting, for example, it's really, you know, connected with what now is become very important in the Dutch you know, issues, that we are talking a very long time ago, you know, we already very long time ago, how, you know, we already create like a free, you know, a citizen, we can say that, something like that, among the Indonesian, when during that time slavery still was become the center of the imperialism and colonialism. So that's so what interesting for me. So this kind of thing will give a tremendous, I think, information for Indonesian history and also the teaching Indonesian history. Yeah.
So Apri, when you start teaching again, will you use revolutionary worlds, and if so, how? Di samping chapter Apri sendiri, buku ini Revolutionary Worlds, cara bagaimana bisa dimanfaatkan dalam pendidikan?
Banyak data yang bisa berbicara ketika kita melihat bahwa revolusi yang ada di Indonesia itu bukan hanya milik Belanda dan Indonesia, tetapi orang India juga menjadi aktor di dalamnya. Itu yang harus kita tahu, harus kita ajari bahwa ada sisi lain dalam revolusi sosial Indonesia, terutama orang-orang minoritas yang harus diajar, minoritas yang harus diketahui oleh mahasiswa.
Okay, so that there were more actors in the time of revolution, that students also need to learn about them. So that's very important, I think. Right? So Bambang said, I'm not that involved in teaching, but you are the head of the history department.
Because I'm teaching at university, so definitely I will use this book this semester to my students, and they have to review it. And I'm teaching from undergraduate until PhD. So this was already on my list for them to read. And that's the thing that we try to develop in UGM. So the first year, especially for undergraduate, is very hard, actually, indeed. It's kind of, we are trying to introduce many things that they never learned during the high school, for example. But we didn't really dictate it, actually, but we're opening up option that there are this book, there are these sources, that there are different, you know, kind of historiographies, and then actually they can find it on the social media, for example, and on the other side, we are as a lecturer sometimes also, you know, there are some students come up with very critical questions, basically because why we don't listen to it, why we don't know this before. And what's happening actually? So then we start really introducing kind of more critical historical understanding, especially on this you know, level of education. But of course, for other level, for school textbooks, it's beyond our reach actually, to be honest, because there's another regime of bureaucracy, you know, there.
It's the same in the Netherlands.
Oh, really?
So yeah,
well, thank you.
Let's not go into that. Roel, are you the kind of teacher that when you have a course, you pop up your own book and say, actually, this is your course book, or how will you use Revolutionary Worlds?
No, I'm not that kind of guy. But you know, in a real sense, there have been colleagues from the UK and other countries, but also colleagues from my own neck of the woods, so to say, who have asked for, you know, how do we use this? So in that sense, it's a very interesting development. Yeah, I have so many ideas or answers I could give you as to how this book can be applicable. But I mean, for example, violence studies, our section of political history at the University of Utrecht has a strand that really looks into those kinds of dynamics. There you can apply it. For violence studies, how do you treat like perpetrators, bystanders, and victims or survivors, and what are the relations between, are those categories fluid? How do you deal with ideology during warfare and conflict, all those kinds of things. But I mean, from a broader perspective, as I already hinted at, there's this need I feel for, especially in the Netherlands, to have a more profound understanding of how entrenched and racist and extractive empire was, not only elsewhere, because we always tend to think that, oh, the Netherlands was the good guy in the classroom and on the international stage, but lo and behold, that's absolutely not the case. So this is a very interesting way of, I don't know, applying this book or using it if you want. Again, I'm not going to set your curriculum. But on the other hand, in the Netherlands, I also feel that we usually don't engage with how racist or the Netherlands still are or is, and how colonial we still are, and how much alive the colonial mindset is. And again, here too, you can apply some of the lessons of this book and drive that point very much home.
Thank you. Please join me in an applause for this wonderful panel, who will be seated, remain seated, because we now go into the Q&A. If you have a question, both for the panelists of this panel, but also of the previous panel, Tom will come up to you, and please, the others are in the first row. Please join. Tom has better eyes, he said. I see at least 5, 6, and the number is growing. So let's just start with the lady here, and then we'll come to you also.
Thank you very much.
And please state your name.
Yes, my name is Michelle Segon von Banchet. I have thinking. I learned a lot this afternoon from all the different standpunten, all the different discussions and research. And the most important thing is that I have to think from the independence thinking from people. In this case, it's about Indonesians. But my background is for more than 50% Indonesian, but also French. And also my father and his brother were advisors from Sukarno. And my mother's side were other things in that day. So I'm geformed by all that thinking, but in the Netherlands. I didn't know of war. I didn't know of issues that we're talking about from the Bermudas of the Independence War. Yeah. So I have been thinking, I want to propose another paradigm.
Please do, briefly, please do.
Yeah. For me, it's about re-examining the multicultural and multi-ethnic independence progress as a research object. And not because we want to start from, let's say, 17 September 1945. But I want to start from now, because there are the dynamic, psychodynamics from different cultural groups. And that is also my group. That's why I started with saying something a little bit from my background, that it's a psychodynamic issue.
Thank you. So what you are proposing is, why not also put multiculturality, the fact that Indonesia is a multifaceted nation, in the core of perhaps future projects. And so first and foremost, would anyone of the Indonesian panelists like to respond? So multiculturalism or the multicultural nature of Indonesia as the core of research. perhaps a brief answer or a response by anyone of the panelists from Indonesia. Siapa yang mau respond?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, to say that that's one of our aims. If you go to one of the articles on Depok, that's really the way that how it thinks. So we know. I mean, exactly because we already studied about the way that the Dutch historiography, and we also know about our historiography, and then that's why we try to combine it, putting it together, you know, into the context of the global society now. So then, if you go through that article, you can see that how, you know, we put it together with different perspective, and then why? Because we know this is not only about, you know, the Dutch or Indonesia, but it's you know, it involves a lot of different things. Because of that, you can go. Especially, I'm not. I cannot say on behalf of our friend from the Netherlands, but if you go through every chapter written by Indonesian, you can feel that. You can feel that. Although we didn't really go far, you know, deep into that issues, but I think we already released by a kind of what call it hate, or maybe thinking about you know, enemies, something like that. We already released. We're free from that kind of thing. Yeah.
Beautiful answer. It's in the book, so to say, where in different chapters. We'll first go to the back, and then we'll come to you, Mr. Pondag. And you can ask your questions in any language. So if you feel more comfortable asking your questions in Dutch or Bahasa Indonesia, silakan ya. We have Tom.
Hi, Wim. First of all, congratulations to the first panelist and the second panelist. Thank you for bringing us your collective research to us, for those information. We appreciate it. I have two simple questions. My name is Sharon Reyes. I am international journalist. Thank you for KITLV for giving me the opportunity to see this symposium. My question is, when people will going to read your research or your book, what do you want from them? What do you want to the people, especially for the young generation of Indonesian young generation and for the Dutch people, generation? How do you want them to feel and experience about your book?
Thank you.
What is your exact goal?
A wonderful but complex question. And then Pak Bambang points to others. Yes, that's very smart.
Wahid.
Jadi siapa yang mau mulai? So, anyone.
On behalf of Indonesian. Wahid.
Thank you for very interesting questions. Well, maybe it's not easy to answer, but for me, it's we expect that the readers, especially among Indonesians perhaps, to feel the Indonesia. This is Indonesia. Indonesia is a big country with a very complex history. This is only an episode, and which is connected with the previous episode. And we try our best actually to represent the complexity of our history. And Indonesia is such a great country with variety and differences and different historical trajectories. And that's what we try to present in this book. So previous the questions asking about multiculturality, we are doing actually this multicultural approach in our way of writing of history. We presented different group of society which is previously maybe unheard or never revealed in our national narrative. So that's what I want to say maybe as an answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Wahid. Mr. Pondag.
Yang paling penting tidak disebut di sini tahun 2011. Kalau itu tidak terjadi, Yayasan Komite Utang Kormat Belanda menang di pengadilan Belanda, menggugat pemerintah Belanda kasus Rawa Gede. Kalau itu tidak terjadi, tidak mungkin kalian di sini semua.
Het belangrijkste wat eigenlijk gebeurd is, dat hebben jullie verzwegen. The most important thing that happened has not been discussed. It was a victory over in 2011 regarding the court case in Rawagede. If that hadn't happened, none of you were here.
Pertanyaan kedua, Belanda selalu mengatakan Hindia Belanda. Apakah tanah air 18.000 km jauh punya Belanda?
So, the Dutch talk about the Netherlands Indies, is a country 18,000 kilometers away Dutch.
Saya menyesal berat bahwa moderator itu bukan orang bangsa Indonesia.
I find it very disappointing that the moderator of this event is not an Indonesian.
Yang saya mau mengatakan juga, apa yang bapak-bapak dan ibu-ibu yang meneliti sejarah, apa yang dilakukan oleh orang-orang yang dibunuh dan dieksekusi. Ini saya ada daftar 830 nama yang diteliti oleh NIMH. Apa yang Anda akan melakukan? Dan kedua, ini om saya yang dieksekusi. Saya tidak kenal beliau, tapi kakaknya saya kenal. Karena waktu dia dieksekusi saya belum lahir. Kenapa dia dieksekusi? Karena dia ada peta. Peta di mana ada minyak, emas dan sebagainya. Karena itu dia dieksekusi.
So, all of you historians, why are you not looking into a list that I have of 830 names of victims? And another thing, this is a picture of my uncle, whom I have never known. He was executed because he had the map of the valuables, the gold, and this is the reason that he was killed.
So, different questions. Let's skip the one about the moderator. But no, there were important questions that were raised, and I would like to give the floor to both the panelists who are sitting on the stage, but also those who are on the front row, to respond. Actually, so how in the project, the court cases and the attention that were brought in 2011, how are they factored in this project? Is there, Irene? Yes. Please then come to Tom, and he will not give you the microphone, but he will hold the microphone.
Oh, yes, sure.
Yes.
Well, the first question, well, it was not a question, but it was a statement. And I can respond to this, but I think many of us agree, but I will do it out of my own name. Setuju. Absolutely. The fact that those court cases were run in 2011 changed, that it is like a judge has spoken his verdict, that really changes the way people think in the Netherlands, and that has led to eventually being able to get funding to do a research like this. It was one very important factor among also other factors, but it was very important. So, yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you, Irene. So, Martijn.
I want to say something about Nederlands-Indië. we had a lot of discussions in the Dutch research group, and also I know that the Indonesian group had discussions about terms, terminology, and we also had that as in the group as a whole. And of course, we are aware of what you say when you say Nederlands-India, that there's a kind of frame placed upon the Indonesian archipelago. And one of the things I think Bambam was really helping us in this respect, because you're grown up in these words. We are all aware that they have a connotation that has problems. We also want to communicate with the different societies we are part in. And well, maybe Bambam, you can explain yourself how you helped us with the term Indonesian archipelago in the 19th century, how we dealt with that.
Can I do it?
Yeah. I don't want to.
Karena pertanyaannya pakai bahasa Indonesia, saya takut orang mengira saya tidak bisa lagi berbahasa Indonesia. Saya akan jawab dengan bahasa Indonesia. Nanti kalau karena itu saya meneruskan apa yang disampaikan oleh moderator, beli buku, dibaca, ya kan? Nanti kita akan terlihat di situ bahwa terminologi yang kita gunakan adalah kepulauan Indonesia. Indonesian archipelago. Tidak ada satu single word kecuali untuk the Netherlands East Indies Government. Itu karena itu adalah realitas sejarah. Pemerintah Hindia Belanda itu realitas sejarah yang tidak bisa kita hapus. Ya.
Please respect Professor Purwanto who is responding to you. Jadi harus kan ada jawab daripada beliau. Silakan bicara dulu.
Jadi itu adalah soal perspektif. Itu perspektif Belanda. Perspektif Indonesia karena itu. Jadi jangan ini dulu. Jadi kalau dalam perspektif Indonesia, ya itu adalah kepulauan Indonesia. Jadi ini apa namanya yang ingin bisa kami sampaikan. Yang berkaitan dengan tadi apa data, kami dengan sangat senang sekali kalau kami diberikan datanya. Semua sejarawan itu sangat senang kalau diberikan data, sangat senang. Terima kasih sekali kalau kami dapat apalagi detail, nama semua, peristiwa segalanya. Karena mencarinya juga setengah mati kalau bekerja sebagai sejarawan. Dan saya merasa gembira sekali bahwa kunjungan saya pertama kali ke sini itu tahun 1989. Jadi sudah di abad yang lalu. Jadi tidak di abad ke-21. Jadi saya berada di Belanda. Jadi saya berada di Belanda ini tidak di abad ke-21, tapi saya sudah ada mulai ada di sini di abad ke-20 yang lalu. Jadi kalau hitungan abad, saya sudah 1 abad yang lalu berada di Belanda. Jadi terima kasih. Saya kira itu yang bisa saya respon. Kalau mungkin ada pertanyaan yang lain.
Professor Purwanto for an answer where you explained that in the book that everyone has to buy, the term is only used when it refers to specific historical institutions that were named in a way that they were named. But otherwise, the word Indonesian archipelago is being used. All data are very welcome. And so we would like to move to the next question. There is a question over there. I see a hand over there. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, my name is Fitri Ajelita. I'm a journalist here. I'm an Indonesian journalist working for the Dutch news website nu.nl. Thank you so much for your presentation and for the contribution you made to voice Indonesian perspectives that has for a long time not been available here in the Netherlands and still isn't. My question is actually twofold. First of all, I'm very curious about, of course I haven't read the book yet and I'm really looking forward to, but I'm very curious about whether or not the apartheid that Dutch colonization has caused in Indonesia is being spoken about in your works. Whether or not if it's in this book or maybe in later works or previous works, I would also like to know. Because in the Dutch telling of history, I for one grew up here in the Netherlands, it's very telling that this side of history is not at all known. It's being erased completely. That we as a nation were not allowed to have education. We were not allowed to speak Dutch. We were compared with monkeys and animals. Is this shown in your work at all? That's my first question. And the second one is, when I talk to Indonesians about our history, my Indonesian brothers and sisters in Indonesia, and I talk about how the Dutch people tell our history, claim it as their own, they say, okay, but it's already done. We already won. We already have a country. And you're here and you are doing very important work. How would you convince them to contribute in their own perspective and in their own discipline to spread the message of Indonesians and our history and our legacy? Thank you.
So who would like to respond to those two questions? One of these racial inequality, apartheid, both legal as well as social and political, and the other, basically ownership of history and co-ownership, perhaps, that is perhaps the basis of collaboration. So who would like to first kick off the response? Sukarelawan, diminta.
Well, actually, it was discussed quite lengthily in the presentation of Apriani and Anne van der Veer. They are really showing how the segregations of ethnicity or race is cost a lot, and that's because become the long durée route, historical route of violence that was erupted during the period. And that's why, as my colleague Roel has described nicely, that our research really, seeing that whatever happening in this period is have very long route, and then that's why I think almost all the chapters mention it in one way or another about that. For the second question, if I can understand you correctly, at least we can really say that we tried to write a really critical history of our own. And that's really, if we can come to that level, then we can be a mature as a nation. So I think that's very important. And then to accept that, okay, aside from the glorious thing, aside that what we have learned in the school, there are many things that we need to also to know about what was happening on the ground, on the society, which is to many extent actually still alive in the memory of our people today. And if we don't provide them with this critical approach, it could be easily manipulated for certain political purposes. And I can tell you more about this, but that's for now, I think, my answer.
Thank you, thank you. I think we have time for, I'm looking at one last question, yes.
Yes, thank you. My name is Robin de Bruin. We've heard a lot about local perspectives. We've heard a lot about multiple revolutions. However, the title of this book launch is Bridging the Narratives. And I still do not have a clear picture of what the bridge actually looks like. Can you say something more about that? And this is especially a question to Roel Fracking.
Yes. Go ahead. Anyway. Can I go first?
Yes, sure.
Thank you so much for the question. Well, I mean, if you talk about bridging narratives, it was already hinted at by the previous question. In the Netherlands, we've always, or not always, but for some time, quite a long time actually, we stopped basically with charting and analyzing to an extent our own, or at least not necessarily our own, but the Dutch perspective. And I feel that this project obviously is a corrective to that in a sense, not discounting all the other history research that's being done. But my point is the bridging the narratives is basically, our book is an attempt to have two often distinct historiographies and interpretation of this particular period and what it meant and what has happened during these periods, to have those distinct stories come together in a way. And this is exactly what this group, I feel, has done, particularly because of how it's been constituted and what kind of questions it has posed from this specific period of time, this revolution. So bridging the narratives basically is a semantic expression of how we try to do that. And again, this is very important. As I said, I started my answer with the idea, and this is very common, that Dutch perspectives, at least from the Dutch perspective, if that makes sense, continue to dominate. And I feel that this is a starting point to offer different avenues of this particular period of time. And as I said, this is the start of this process. And in the Netherlands, we tend to have this thing which is called collective amnesia as to what has happened here. And again, hopefully this book provides, along with the other books, as a reminder that we need to get rid of that. And that's, to me at least, what this meant, bridging the narrative. I hope that clarifies a little bit. But again, if you really, all the nitty-gritty details are in the books.
Anyone else who would like to add on these aspirational words by Rolf Rocking? Jerry, please.
I thought one of the narratives that did cross that bridge is about the revolution. And we've talked a lot about people who experienced the revolution problematically. We've talked less about people who really lived out the revolution. And I'm thinking particularly of the chapter by Galuh about women in Yogyakarta in the very early days of the revolution, for whom the whole experience was incredibly emancipatory, not only from the point of view of liberation from the apartheid that was mentioned, but also liberation from the ingrained cultural patriarchy and hierarchy and feudalism with which they had grown up. Farabi Faki's chapter about youth, also in Yogyakarta, in the revolutionary capital, is a fabulous chapter that conveys something about the possibility of making a better world. And we also see it in the outer islands, very complicated, but the drive from below and the belief that a better world is possible is also visible there in those chapters. And I have an idea that this idea that a better world is possible did cross that bridge to the Netherlands historiography as well. I think, anyway.
Thank you, Jerry. And please join me in an applause for this wonderful panel. And thank you also. So, yes. And before I give the floor for the closing remarks, perhaps on a very brief personal note, the complexities, the multiculturality, that's why I'm looking forward reading also these works, obviously, and I'm as proud of one of my distant relatives, Wim Manuhutu, who was among the Indonesian youth who tore down the Dutch flag in Surabaya in '45. So I actually feel proud of him. So thank you very much. And the floor now is to Martijn Heikhoff in his capacity as the director of NIOD.
Yeah, I'm not Ben Schoenmaker.
No, I was thinking you're not Ben Schoenmaker.
I'm replacing him. He was on his way, but due to personal circumstances, he had to return home. So I'm the one who is doing the closing remarks. We've reached the end of the program. I imagine there's still much to say. I can feel there's much to say. Later on, there are drinks in which you can exchange your impressions of today. I already feel a kind of nostalgia because the project which I enjoyed so much and from which I learned so much is about to end. but there's also good news. There are more volumes to be presented in the next year. There will be 4 more presentations of Otgoy books. Wahid, I'm very curious to read or learn more about the reviews your Indonesian students will write about the books we made. I think that is extremely nice that you are doing this. Before we close, I would like to thank first our Indonesian guests and colleagues, Bu Apriani, Pak Bambang, Pak Wahid, and Ibu Yulianti for coming to the Netherlands and joining this meeting. We appreciate it very much you are here. And I also want to thank Ratna Saptari for her wonderful reflection, which gave the day a very good start, I think, and our moderator Wim Manuhutu for keeping us together. I think you did really a very great job. Thank you very much. Then there was the KITLV NIOD team that organized this day. Yaya Siegers, Katie Dijgen, Wendel ten Arve, and Ferdinand Sluiter. And there were a lot of volunteers from KITLV, Eva Thielen, Meerte Krijgen, Tom Hogevorst, Sander van der Horst, Wietja Toeslian. And I also want to thank AUP for being here and co-organizing Sabine Stolz. And the tragic of thanking people is that you always forget people. So I hope I have mentioned everybody. And Irene, you are saying something? I'm forgetting something. Yeah. So indeed, I was forgetting something very important. I want to thank the technical support offered by the museum and the Museum for Volkenkunde for the hospitality today. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. And nee. There are drinks downstairs.
Het is een goed panel. Ja, kijk, je hebt natuurlijk altijd